So we have it. Remember all the sessions we have in our private YouTube channel. So if you need that information, you can let me know, but we're happy to share it. I do hope everyone found some way to have a nice Thanksgiving. I saw some beautiful pictures of meals and some Zoom conversations and pumpkin pies and all that kind of stuff. But I do hope you found a way to just enjoy each other and enjoy your family and just take a breath as well. Gadi, we're happy to have you, and we'll turn it over to you.
Just I need you to make me a
Going to do this.
co-host.
Yes.
That would be awesome.
You are officially co-hosted.
Yay. Okay, you've still got some people coming in. So shalom y'all, as we say in this part of the world. Believe it or not, I actually celebrated Thanksgiving as well with my in-laws. We have, I grew up on a turkey farm, on a kibbutz that grew turkeys. So I don't like Thanksgiving. I've had turkey in any way, shape, or form you can imagine, and some you can't imagine. So Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving, and almost Hanukkah to everyone. I took a slightly different approach today, and I think I've been boring you with the history of the region, hopefully not boring, but I'm going to go a little bit different today, and hopefully it'll be enjoyable for everyone. So without further ado, let us, wow, look at all these plethora of options. What is going on here? Hold on. Technical difficulties, just 1 second. That's not what we wanted. Here's what we wanted. Okay, very good. So let's see how we can do this and get us going. And we'll start playing around with the Middle East, and we'll see what's new in the Middle East. We have all kinds of exciting things going on. So, uh-oh, that's not what we wanted. Zelotov. Rega, sorry, folks.
Healthy dog.
I think we're getting there. Yes, okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit different. What I want to do today is to, we got all the way up to the Ottoman Empire. We'll go through that fairly quickly. And then I want to relate to a couple of issues that are going on today and try to go backwards. Here are the issues that we have today in Israel. Let's understand where they came from, and we'll go back and talk about the recent history of those things. So the Ottoman Empire, this guy is Suleiman the Magnificent that conquers the region. I know you've never seen him, but that's okay. There's actually a drawing of him. Here he is. That's Suleiman the Magnificent. He's very modest as well, conquers the entire Middle East and goes all the way, in fact, all the way to the gates of Vienna. He was on the other side of the Danube, close to Vienna. And he builds a few interesting things in Jerusalem, namely the walls of Jerusalem, the Tower of David. Much of what we see in Jerusalem today is Ottoman. And then the Ottomans lose to the British and the French in World War I, 1917. A lot about this very soon. And after the British take over, they essentially, I think I wanted, here we go, General Allenby conquers the area for the British Army. We'll talk about more about the Battle of Gaza and Beersheba coming up very soon. General Allenby is very important for the Jewish people. As you know, every city in Israel basically has an Allenby Street. And as you can see in the map, the area is divided. Syria and Lebanon of today are British. Iraq and parts of Syria are under the British control. Syria and Lebanon are under the French control, and we in Palestine are part of the British Mandate. given to the British after World War I by the League of Nations, essentially the predecessor of the United Nations of today. In 1922, Transjordan becomes the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Don't worry about the term, it won't be on the test. And it becomes an independent state, and the British remain in the area that is called Palestine, which today is part of the state of Israel. So continuing, let's go back actually, if we can. Whoop, here we go. The main reason for the balagan, the mess in the Middle East today, is this guy, Lawrence of Arabia. By the way, this is Peter O'Toole. It's not actually him, but it looks convincing. And if you've seen the movie, you've seen him galloping around the deserts on a camel, which, by the way, is not a very comfortable way to gallop around the deserts. So I'm sure he had some serious pains, whether it's Lawrence or Peter O'Toole that was playing him. But the bottom line is that Lawrence, who's a British officer, spends a lot of time in the Middle East, convinces the British Empire and the French, the Allies, to promise Bedouin tribes in the Hijaz, the area that today is Saudi Arabia and Syria and Jordan and Egypt, promising them land and their own independence if they fight against their common enemy, which is the Ottomans. And Lawrence, of course, succeeds. The British and the French win, and the map of the Middle East is drawn up by these people. And we'll see in a moment what that map looks like. Here we go. Did I miss something? I did. Where is that? Oh, well. In 1917, as far as Israel is concerned, or the Jews, this is a very, very important decisive moment on November of 1917, as the British are approaching the city of Jerusalem. Lord Balfour, who's the Secretary of State of His Majesty's government, this is George V, I want to say. I'm probably, yeah, I think he's the fifth, and the stuttering guy is George VI, but doesn't matter. I might be confused with which George they were, but Lord Balfour gives a statement, a letter, and this is the entire letter, nothing. He says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors, yada, 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 to facilitate this achievement of this object. Wow, the Jews are ecstatic. This is amazing. Finally, a superpower of the world is recognizing our right to this land. So this is a very decisive moment. On the 17th of November, by the way, the same year, General Allenby marches into Jerusalem and takes over the city. And we celebrated in 2017 100 years of this event, and more about that very soon. Wait a minute. No, I guess I missed it somehow. At any rate, what I want to do today is to bring up a few issues that are interesting for us in the Middle East. So the Iranian and Shia Islam issues that are going on in the Middle East, which influences in turn the Lebanon front and Hezbollah. I think that's a mistake, but you'll pardon my Israeliness and spelling mistakes, and how that connects even more to the Gaza Strip and Hamas and the rockets that are fired still now on Israel. So these are modern issues that I'm going to try and connect through their historical connections. So first of all, let's understand what's going on here. So the Middle East, as you can see, divided into these countries, which this division is in many ways based on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is an agreement made in 1917, a little bit before the end of the war, where the British and the French divide between them the areas of the Middle East. So once again, French get Lebanon of today and Syria of today, and parts of Iraq. The British get parts of Iraq, Jordan, Israel of today, and Egypt. And of course, why do both countries want Iraq? Because there's a very important element that is starting to be important for the modern world, and that is oil. And of course, the Persian Gulf and the oil is very, very important for these superpowers. And I didn't even mention, which I should, the United States that gets involved in all of this as well. So we're going to move forward once again and talk about these modern issues and understand where they came from. So the Shiite area of the world, we'll talk about that very soon, is in Iran mostly. But in our area, we also have Lebanon and Syria, who are Shiite, essentially Shiite countries. Syria is controlled by a group called the Alawites. I won't get into it too much, but they're essentially a branch of Shiite Islam. So Assad, the president of Syria, is of course supported by Iran and by other Shiite forces. And in Lebanon, and you can see, by the way, Damascus, Beirut, Haifa, just so you understand, from the border of the Golan Heights over here to Damascus, it's 40 miles. That's it. Imagine what's 40 miles from where you live. It's nothing compared to distances in Europe or in the US. And from Haifa to Beirut, I would say it's about 80 miles, maybe a little bit more than that. I used to live right over here at the corner where the border meets the ocean, the Mediterranean. And we used to joke that we're closer to Beirut than we are to Tel Aviv, which distance-wise is true. So this is, the distances here are very small. In Lebanon, you have a mix of Shiite and Sunni, as well as Druze. It's another, not exactly ethnic, but more a religious group. And these three groups don't really get along. And of course, Hezbollah, the party of God, is the translation, is a Shiite terrorist organization supported by Iran that is sitting on the border with Israel and causing trouble, and more about that coming up very soon. So I have my reminder here to go to Google Maps and show you a couple of things. If I can actually make this happen. There we go. So we're going to switch to Google Maps, and we're going to start at a very interesting place, which we call, that is the beginning of Shiite Islam. And this is in Iraq. I don't know if any of you were ever in Iraq, and if you were, I'm jealous. In Iraq, there is a city called Karbala. And Karbala is the center of Shiite Islam. So here we are in the center of the holy city of Karbala. There are two mosques at the end. You can see one of the mosques over here. This, of course, is a major boulevard of connections here. This is another very important mosque. I believe that this one is the burial site of a guy named Hussein, who is the son of Ali, and Ali is the son-in-law of Muhammad. When Muhammad dies, there's a battle between the two sides of Islam, who's going to continue and take over. Long story short, Hussein is killed in battle, and that begins the great schism of Islam between the Shiite and Sunni Muslims. Karbala is the Mecca of Shiite Islam. It's in Iraq. Iraq itself is a mixture between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, which is one of the biggest issues that Iraq has today, because neither side, Shiite or Sunni, is able to rule in a way that is acceptable to the other side. As you know, the United States was trying to make sense of all of this without too much success over there. So let's go back to our presentation and learn a little bit more about Shiite and Sunni Islam and how it leads to our issues. This is a short video. I think this young lady gives a excellent explanation of what's the difference and how can we relate to that difference.
The term Sunnis and
Can you
Shiites
guys
get
hear?
thrown
Give me a
around
thumbs
lot
up
when
if you
discussing
can
Middle
hear.
Eastern conflicts. Sometimes it's useful, but most of the time it feels like it's just shorthand for these people hate each other. The term Sunnis and Shiites get thrown around a lot when discussing Middle Eastern conflicts. Sometimes it's useful, but most of the time it feels like it's just shorthand for these people hate each other. But with over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, there's no way they can all be involved in some Hatfields and McCoy-style blood feud. So what's really going on here? Well, first of all, not all Sunnis and Shiites are at war with each other. There are tons of places where they coexist peacefully, like the United Arab Emirates or Dearborn, Michigan, for example. It's also worth noting that their religions aren't diametrically opposed. In fact, the Sunni-Shiite conflict isn't even really about religion. It's about power. Originally, Muslims were all one group unified under the Prophet Muhammad. Then, in the year 632, Muhammad died, and Muslims split off into two separate groups. The Sunnis wanted Muhammad's successor to be chosen by his community of followers, while the Shiites wanted the leadership to stay within the Prophet's family. The Sunnis were in the majority, so they chose their new leader to be the Caliph, which is basically the head of state. The Shiites did not recognize this new leader, and instead, they chose Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, as their new imam, which also basically means head of state. That was the main source of divide, and from there, things really only got worse. Early on, most of the Shiite imams met violent ends at the hands of the stronger Sunni
Battle
caliphs,
of Karbala,
including Imam Ali's son, Hussein,
where we
whose
just
beheading
visited.
is still considered a major holiday for Shiite Muslims. Today, there are numerous Sunni and Shiite militant groups, terrorist organizations, and oppressive governments. Being Sunni or Shiite doesn't necessarily make you a member or even a supporter of those groups, but they're still divided up that way. In fact, every nation with Sunni-Shiite conflicts has large militant groups on both sides, and they all have a history of oppressing one another depending on who's currently in power. Iraq, for example, was run by an oppressive Shiite regime before Saddam, then an oppressive Sunni regime under Saddam, followed by an oppressive Shiite regime once again after Saddam left power. Now the oppressive Sunni militant group ISIS is threatening to take over huge parts of the country. So you can see that the Sunni-Shiite conflicts are more about power, politics, and retribution than actual religion. And truthfully, the words Sunni and Shiite aren't even the best words to use when discussing Sunni-Shiite conflicts. They are way too general. If you're talking about militant jihadists or terrorist networks, but what you really mean is ISIS or Al-Qaeda, just say ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Otherwise, you're including billions of people who aren't even involved and most likely don't share the beliefs of those fringe organizations.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope this gave you a little bit more information about the Shiite Sunni issues. No? Okay, so this affects in a very interesting way the borders of Israel in the north. Syria, as I said, supported by Iran as the strongest Shiite force in the Middle East, and in Lebanon, the Shiites tend to have the upper hand in the last couple of decades, mainly after the Lebanon war with Israel, which we'll talk about next. So let's continue and see. No. Okay, here's the division between Shiite and Sunnis in the world. 75% of the Muslims of the world, you can see this little chart in the bottom, 75% of them are Sunni. The Middle East is where most of the Shiites are. Iran, as you can see, 95% Shiite. Iraq, 65 to 70%. Syria, this is interesting, only about 20%, but they are the ruling regime. Assad, Hafez al-Assad, the father, and Bashar al-Assad, his son today, who's in control today, are Alawites / Shiites. And as she said, it's much about power. Interesting, this area, Kuwait, Bahrain, the Arab Emirates, there's a lot of Shiites over here, but yet they're very moderate. And part of the battle in the Middle East is the Sunnis against the Shiites. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey is somewhat involved, but I won't get into it too much. All of these nations are battling against Iran about who will be the strongest Muslim country, essentially pushing and doing things in the Middle East. By the way, another conflict that's going on today, you can see Azerbaijan with Shiite Muslims. Just so you understand, Azerbaijan and Israel have a very good connection, just to compare with Iran and Israel, both Shiite countries, Azerbaijan much, much, much more moderate than Iran. And right next to it, this gray area is Armenia. There's a battle going on between the Armenians and the Azerbaijan in the last few months. It's been in the news, and it's based on religion because Armenia is Christian. But I won't get into that too much. So the situation in the Middle East essentially reflects on Israel because Iran does not have a land border with Israel. So what they do instead is they essentially sponsor Syria and Lebanon, and that way they have a land border with Israel. This was the situation in 1992, when 1982, sorry, when the first Lebanon war breaks out. And what happened during this war, the blue line here is the border between Israel and Lebanon. 1982 was known as Peace for the Galilee operation. Israel wanted to go into Lebanon because there was constant firing of missiles, Katyusha rockets, on Israeli villages and towns. Yours truly grew up essentially right over here next to Nahariya. And I remember as a kid being in shelters because the PLO and Hezbollah and others were firing rockets at Israel. Israel in 1982, 5th of June, goes into Lebanon and essentially pushes the Palestinian organizations and the Shiite organizations past this blue line. This blue line is a river called the Litani. And when we say river in the Middle East, it's not the Mississippi or the Columbia River. You guys understand that. It's a smaller version of those things. And the reason for pushing beyond the Litani was it was a natural barrier that Israel could then later on defend when we didn't want these guys to come back. Israel ended up staying in Lebanon for 18 years until the year 2000, when we unilaterally withdrew, unilaterally meaning we didn't have an agreement with Lebanon or the forces that were in here, and Israel withdraws back to the blue line. Now, what you see here is a very famous picture. This is Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon was the Minister of Defense. Begin was the Prime Minister. 1982, June, there was some conflicts between them about how far to go into Lebanon. But the bottom line is that Israel ended up staying for 18 years and keeping this buffer zone that you see here from the border until the Litani River, this light blue line. So in the background, you can see the Balfour Fortress, which I think is one of the coolest places in the area. Unfortunately, I've never been there. I've seen it from afar, wearing uniform and driving my tank along the border of Israel. But this is an incredible place. Look at these amazing views. Right behind us is the fortress of the Balfour. It's a Crusader fortress, Beaufort in French. My French is non-existent, but you can see the remains that we see here are the remains of this Crusader castle. And down below here is the Litani River. Now, why would the Crusaders build a fortress up here? Because he who controls this spot controls essentially everything that goes on in this region. So this was an important spot for the Israeli army to take over after during the war of the Peace for the Galilee, 1982. And here down below, you can see the Litani River. And essentially over here, it makes a turn to the west. This is actually north-south, and then it makes a turn, which is, as you can see, a very, very deep canyon. And if you control up here, you're in control of the entire area. Just so you get your bearings, if we look way in the distance over here, you can actually see an antenna here on this place. This is Kibbutz Misgav-Am, the most northern point in Israel, most northern kibbutz in Israel. And behind it, this ridge with the volcanoes on it is the Golan Heights. And of course, this big ridge over here in the distance is Mount Hermon, which most of what we're seeing is actually Lebanon, and the other side of the ridge is Syria. So very cool spot. Unfortunately, during the Lebanon War, 1982, Israel lost about 35 Golani soldiers who were taking this fortress. And as you can imagine, look at the slopes to infantry to climb up to this fortress. The PLO was holding on very, very strong. And unfortunately, as I said, 35 Israeli infantry soldiers were killed. One of them, the commander, is the brother of my kids' principal in their school. And Peter, I'm sure, remembers this, Guni Hernik. We used to talk about him in Mount Herzl to the Nifty kids because his story was actually a very important story in the story of the IDF. So this is the area of the Balfour and the Lebanon War, and its influence today. The reason I bring this up is because Hezbollah is now posted all along this border, because when Israel unilaterally withdrew, we essentially left this area open, and Hezbollah, supported by Iran, is today on the border with Israel. Every now and then we have some skirmishes with Hezbollah. A lot of them have to do with what's happening in Syria today, and more about that is the issue that we're facing today. In fact, 2 or 3 days ago, Israel admitted, which is something we don't do very often, to attacking Iranian troops in Syria and the outskirts of Damascus. And part of it is to make sure that the Iranians don't set up shop along the border with Syria. It's bad enough we have Hezbollah over here on the border with Lebanon. Excellent. Moving forward, now we are going to talk about the Gaza Strip. As you know, the Gaza Strip is an area where Hamas took over, and more about that very soon. But the Gaza Strip, what we're seeing here, is an area created at first in the War of Independence, 1948, by the Egyptians. But to better understand what's going on here, I want to take us back to the World War I and the attack that's going on by the British Army against the Ottomans, defending the area of Gaza. And we are right by the Gaza border. And this is a memorial for a group of people known as the Anzac. I'm assuming some of you might have heard of Anzac. If you have family in South Africa or Australia or New Zealand, you for sure have heard of Anzac, because it stands for the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps of the British Army, World War I. And these guys fought in the area of Egypt and eventually helped General Allenby take the city of Gaza and eventually Jerusalem. So the Anzac Memorial in memory of the Australia New Zealand Army Corps who fought in Israel during World War I. The monument is located opposite Gaza, where the units fought against the Turks during the battles in 1917. And on the 1st of November, 1917, Anzac and the British Army are able to take over Gaza with a very interesting way. What they did was, instead of attacking right in front of the Ottoman defenses, and we're talking World War I, trenches and machine guns and anti-tank ditches and everything that you can imagine from Europe was implemented here as well, because the military advisors to the Ottomans were the Germans, and they brought all of their techniques over here. And I don't know if you can see the number, if the number is here or not. No, 11,000 soldiers of Anzac mostly killed in the Battle of Gaza. After a direct assault for the first time, they weren't able to take Gaza. The general in charge was demoted, and then a new general, an up-and-coming guy by the name of Allenby, joins the forces, and he came up with an interesting idea. This is a memorial in the city of Beersheba, Australian light horse, and you'll see in a moment why Beersheba, because what Allenby said, instead of attacking head on over here, this is Gaza, this is Beersheba over here, instead of attacking head on and suffering thousands of casualties, what he did, using mostly the Australian and New Zealand light horse infantry, they rode through the desert, through this dry riverbed with almost no water. They knew that from here to here, until they take Beersheba, they got only the water that they can carry. The Ottomans were expecting the British to attack head on in Gaza and left very little forces in Beersheba. Allenby understood that very easily, relatively easily. They take Beersheba, and then they come in from the back and attack the front lines of the Ottomans and take Gaza with relatively little resistance. And from here, within 2 weeks, okay, this battle was over on November 1st. By November 17th, Allenby marches into Jerusalem, and the Anzac has a very important role in that. Here's a picture of the Australian Light Infantry marching into Jerusalem. And in 2017, I was honored to guide some Australian groups that came to Israel to reenact these together with some New Zealanders. This is from 2017. There were big ceremonies in Beersheba, and it was very cool to be with these groups and to see the reenactments of the Anzac, or the Australian and New Zealanders that did this. In Beersheba, there's a very interesting place. It's new in the town of Beersheba, and this is something that many Israelis don't know about. It's kind of surreal. Look at this nicely manicured and organized military cemetery of the British Army in the middle of suburban Beersheba, right by a park where Israeli kids are playing. Nowadays, there's actually a museum that's built here, and this is a British, or essentially New Zealand and Australian cemetery of the soldiers killed during the attack on Gaza and Beersheba. Excellent. Let's go back to our presentation. So the Gaza Strip was actually created in the War of Independence, when the Palestinians, 700,000 or so Palestinians, people who were living in the land that became Israel, were displaced. Why they were displaced is the million-dollar question. We'll talk about that next week when we focus more on the Israeli-Palestinian issues and on Jerusalem itself. And what essentially what was going on here is that the Palestinians, the Egyptians, were not ready for these refugees to come into Egypt. So they create, around the city of Gaza, they create these refugee camps. And you can see the brown or orange is all refugee camps. The green is essentially the city of Gaza that was already here, the city of Khan Yunis, and the city of Rafah, or Rafah in English, Rafiah in Arabic. And the Egyptians create the Gaza Strip. After 1967, the Six-Day War, which we'll touch upon next week as well, Israel inherits essentially all of the Gaza Strip. And you can see the blue, these are Israeli settlements that, whoa, what is going on here? No. Wow, a lot of technical issues today. Sorry, folks. Here we go. During the 1967, Israel takes over Gaza, and all of this blue is essentially Israeli settlements, Jewish residents of the Gaza Strip. And all of this was essentially evacuated, or Israel unilaterally withdraws once again in 2005, when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and his party are voting to take about 15,000 residents, Jewish residents from these areas, out of the Gaza Strip and create a border along the Gaza Strip, which still exists today. Now, what does unilaterally mean? We didn't negotiate anything with the other side. The other side that remains in there is the Palestinian Authority, or the former PLO. About a year later, Hamas takes over. More about that next week. And Hamas started firing rockets at Israel. Even today, we still have rockets being fired at Israel. The rockets are getting better and better. Their range is getting better. And here's a picture of the range of the rockets. You can see this is the Gaza Strip. The yellow area is what they had in the beginning. And the orange and the reddish orange are rockets that they have today. And who is supplying them these long-range rockets? You guessed it, Iran. Iran is interested, remember, in creating a border, or a physical border with Israel, where they can harass us as much as they can. Now, what's interesting is that Hamas are not Shiites, they're Sunni Muslims. 99% of the Muslims in the land of Israel, what used to be Palestine, are Sunni. But yet Hamas and the Shiite country of Iran are buddy-buddy. Why? Because they have the same enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and therefore they support Hamas from the Gaza Strip and give them money, supplies, and rockets that have a much bigger and farther range than they had originally when they built these rockets. In 2006, I'm sure you've heard of this. This guy, an Israeli soldier, essentially a tank driver, was sitting in his tank overlooking the border with the Gaza Strip. And the Hamas was able to create a tunnel underneath the border with Israel. And the tunnel ended up coming out behind Israeli lines. And what they did, let me see if I can get back here. It was around here in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. The tunnel went underneath the border, showed up behind Israeli lines, and the tank that was looking forward to the border was attacked from behind. The 3 crew members were killed, and Gilad Shalit, the driver, was taken captive and moved around for 5 years in this tiny little Gaza Strip area. Israel did not know where he was. They moved him around a lot. And eventually in 2011, there was a negotiation with the mediation of Egypt to exchange and receive Gilad Shalit back in exchange for thousands of Hamas operatives that were released back to Gaza and to the West Bank. Today, Israel still has issues with Gaza. Some of our issues are the rockets. In order to get rid of the rockets, we created a very special technology known as protective edge. As Iron Dome. It's not an actual Iron Dome. It's essentially a Doppler radar that picks up any rocket that's fired from Gaza. and the computer very, very quickly calculates where it's going to land, and a high-speed missile is fired at it. Actually, 2 missiles are fired at that rocket and shoots that rocket out of the sky. Notice I use different terminology. What's the difference between rocket and missile? The rocket is dumb. It's fire and you don't know where it's going to fall. You can try and aim it, but it's not very accurate. A missile is launched and you can still guide it, and it's guided by either a heat signature or a laser that actually controls where it's going to hit. The problem is that the rockets that Hamas is firing on Israel cost about $5,000 to make. Each Iron Dome missile costs about $30,000 in cost. So Israel is spending a lot of money shooting these rockets out of the sky. And they know that, which is interesting. The Hamas realized that we're doing this, so they created another way of bothering Israel, which is the tunnels. Nowadays, I don't know if you know this, Israel created, we've developed a kind of a sonar system that picks up tunnel digging under the ground, and we are creating a ditch all along the border with Gaza. It's a 100 feet deep ditch, essentially. There's no other way to describe it. Filling it up with concrete. It's not just concrete, it has sensors in it, so that if the Hamas is digging underneath, trying to go through this concrete wall, it won't be able to, and will pick up with those sensors the fact that these tunnels are being created. So it's a cat and mouse kind of situation. And of course, where does Hamas get all of its money and supplies? From Iran, which we've discussed already. Excellent. Any questions or aha moments, anything you want to share or talk about? Let me get out of this and I'll come back to a speaker view and we can ask questions. All right. I saw there was one, Phil's cousin who lived in Australia was part of the Anzac force. Okay. Has anyone heard of Anzac before?
Yes.
Okay. So the Anzac were very famous, by the way, in the Battle of Gallipoli, which is in the around Greece, sort of by Greece and Turkey. Very big issue, very big event. Thousands and thousands of soldiers were killed on both sides. And to this day in Australia and New Zealand, there's a Anzac Day is a very big day. It's sort of similar to Independence Day, marked and celebrated all over in those countries. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
This is it's sort of indirectly related, I guess. I've always wondered why Israel doesn't respond to rocket fire with a massive artillery barrage. I mean, the downside is terrible. You would be killing civilians, but the upside is that it may create a change in behavior. I can't. If I were a member of Hamas, I would see no reason to stop what I'm doing with the present strategy. Whereas if massive retaliation occurred with each rocket, I would think twice.
Look, I agree. I think the main issue is that Israel is always under scrutiny. Why is it not going back to me? That's interesting. Israel is always under scrutiny by the rest of the world, and unfortunately, it's an interesting situation that we have to wonder what to do when these kind of situations occur. On the one hand, we don't want to kill civilians, and the general idea in Israel is that the population of Gaza should not be punished for the behavior of their government, Hamas. It's an easy thing to say. On the other hand, our population around the Gaza Strip, Moshavim and Kibbutzim and the city of Sderot and Netivot and even Beersheva and Ashkelon and Ashdod are affected by these rockets. So I don't really have an answer to your question, besides the idea that Israel is trying to do the right thing with the population. And as you know, there's been several what we call operations. Pillar, what is it called? Mudanan, grapes. I don't remember the names, but the last was, of course, the Protective Edge in 2014. We've responded with significant power that caused a lot of damage and a lot of casualties. And we really want to be careful with that. So there's other ways to do it, by the way, Robert, right? We don't have to retaliate with artillery. We can cut off their water supply and their electricity and the food. Everything that comes into Gaza comes from Israel. Very, very little comes from Egypt. Electricity, running water, sewage, food, medical supplies. We could do that as well and squeeze the population to respond in turn to overturn the Hamas. There's been several attempts of that, unsuccessfully for the most part. And there's no right or wrong answer there of how to solve that. The Iranian nuclear scientists, someone asked about that. The only thing I can tell you is that this guy was probably the most important person in charge of the nuclear program in Iran. Israelis are very worried about Iran becoming nuclear. And whether or not the Israeli Mossad did this or not, no one has taken responsibility for it. There were some hints by Israeli officials, but there's no official stand that this was carried out by Israel. I think the flip side of it is that the Iranians will want to respond in a big way. And when Israel's concerned, it's probably going to happen either by the Golan Heights or on the Lebanese border, because that's where they have their troops essentially, not necessarily Iranian, Hezbollah and other supporters that could fire at Israel. And we see those attempts going on all the time. Yeah, okay, so I see that was two people asked about that. So I definitely think we're gonna see an Iranian retaliation. There's some talk about perhaps this happening outside of the Middle East, which is also a possibility. They've done that before. The most famous, I think, is the Israeli embassy in Argentina, Buenos Aires. I think that was the mid-90s, if I remember correctly. Lawrence and Margaret, you guys had a question?
Yes. After the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, there was a great deal of political unrest in Israel, particularly from the Israeli settlers who were displaced from Gaza. Is that still an issue?
So the point that is made is that many Israelis felt that this was the wrong move. And in fact, these 15,000 Israelis that were evacuated were supported by a much larger number of Israelis. And there was a lot of backlash, is probably the right word for it. Is this still an issue? Yes, there are definitely parts of Israeli society that feel that this was the wrong thing to do. And they, of course, say, look at what Gaza became because of this. Before we were actually in there and could control some of the Hamas movements. There are other Israelis that say, on the other hand, we created a border and we're able to respond as a country. And this ties into Robert's remark as well. And to add to that, there are Israelis, and I'd say, I don't want to get into percentage, but I'd say there's a good part of the Israeli right-wing politics that basically says that our people fought and bled, and some of us were killed for this land that belongs to us from the biblical times, and therefore giving up any piece of this land is the wrong thing to do. And this goes back even to the Sinai Peninsula given back to Egypt in the peace agreement in 1979. There were people that were evacuated from a small town and a few other settlements in the Sinai Peninsula called Yamit. This is 1981, I think. Also did not go over very well for the Israeli government at the time. So this is definitely an issue. And it ties into what's going on today with the, just today, Benny Gantz, I'm not sure what to call him, the replacement or the other prime minister, he's sworn in as well as Netanyahu. It's an absolute mess. So we actually have two sitting prime ministers. I'm not going to say functioning. And these guys, today there was something that came up about acknowledging or accepting and putting on Israeli rule in the area of the West Bank, Gaza, Judea and Samaria. And the issue is a few spots that were put up. It's called a ma'chaz, which comes from the word hanging on. A few illegal settlements, according to international law, that were created in the last few years, and recognizing them as legal villages. So that stems all the way back to this is ours and we're not leaving, and therefore it has to stay in Israeli hands. There's a question about how does Israel view President-elect Biden? Look, as American president, no matter who he or she is, will always be accepted by Israel as someone amazing in the beginning. Inevitably, towards the end of their term, they tend to get a bad rap in Israel because the United States has different allies in the Middle East. The Saudis, the Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, back in the day before the Trump administration, it was also the Palestinian Authority. So in the beginning, we're all, wow, this is great, a new president, the administration's gonna do wonders. And then when we realize that there's a sale of weapons to the Saudis, and there's support for the Palestinians, and the Egyptians are getting stuff, and all of this sort of causes a situation where Israelis feel like, maybe they're not so supportive of Israel. The Trump administration was very different in that sense because essentially it was a statement saying Israel is right, the Palestinians are wrong. And that was the way a lot of Israelis felt, that this is great and we're being supported by the Americans. There are other Israelis that felt that this is probably not a good way to solve this issue, because the Palestinians feel that the United States is no longer a fair and just mediator in this issue. So that I would say that many Israelis would probably wanted Trump to be reelected. They felt that he did good things for Israel. On the other hand, there are many Israelis that felt that he was going a little too one-sided, and while supportive of Israel, there were some issues that needed to be resolved with regards to the Palestinians. I think the Israeli government is a little worried about dealing with the Biden administration, mainly because there was a very clear view by the Netanyahu administration of support of what Trump is doing. So we're not really sure how to respond to what's going to happen now after Biden takes over, if he is able to take over. And I'm not going to get into your politics, but many Israelis are looking at what's going on across the Atlantic and saying, wow, this is really crazy. Is he really not going to move out of the White House? And is this really something that could happen? Not to mention the electoral college system, which we really don't understand how that works. So I think many Israelis are not really sure what to make of all of this. On the other hand, there's definitely a lot of the Israelis that feel that Biden is a supporter of Israel and that it'll be good for Israel in the long run. There are Israelis that feel that Trump allowed Netanyahu to do too much, and the fact that there would be a moderating force in the White House now might be good for Israel, because it would mean that Israel won't be able to annex the West Bank and do other stuff that perhaps is not a good thing. And again, this is some Israelis would say we should have annexed the West Bank on July 1st, as Netanyahu promised, and eventually didn't actually happen for various reasons. More about this next week. Next week, we're going to focus on Jerusalem, the Palestinians and the Israelis, try to understand some of the terminology, some of the borders and the issues that are going on today. And we'll talk more about that next week. Thank you for listening. I hope this wasn't too painful.
It was
Thank
great.
you
Thank
for
you.
having me. And Rabbi, I'm right on time, even 30 seconds early. So,
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful lesson. Thank you for being so diplomatic around the political issues as well.
I try.
And it's, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. It's nice to see you, and we hope we'll see you at some of the other programs this week. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Shalom.